Hello. This is Derek from One Over Tea and Tao Teaware. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in that last episode, I talked all about Wudong Dancong, and that's Dancong Oolong from Chaozhou, from the Phoenix Mountains, particularly from one mountain, the Wudong Mountain, that volcanic mountain with that really rich soil. That's the home, the ancient ancestral home of Dancong Oolong. That's where all the mother bushes, the oldest trees are, right in that region. And I talked about my friend and maker, Wen Zitong, who I met this year, who's just makes some incredible tea. He's super young, just a reluctant prodigy because he's thinking about everything else he could do with his life. And this is one theme I see a lot going into these villages and into these mountains, into these really rural areas where they're making tea. A lot of the young people, they want to get out because tea is tied to this traditional culture. Tea is tied to the village. It's this old way of living. And a lot of times you're not making a lot of money. Maybe in Wudong Shan you can make quite a bit of money, in the Biluochun area, in the Hangzhou West Lake where you're making the dragon well. But usually tea is tied to the rural regions, it's tied to a lower GDP, and a lot of the youth move out of there. In fact, there's a really cool interview with a Biluochun maker out on Xishan Dao, and that I put up on the YouTube. It's from a while ago, but he tells us about how making tea is so hard, not making enough money, all the youth have moved to the cities and stuff like that. And so it's really just this really interesting insight into the world of tea that a lot of people in the West are kind of not quite tapped into, just because they're not on the grounds. They're not quite seeing this this urge to do something else. And I feel like I have this theory where it's like three generations, like it comes full circle. Like the first generations are the first ones getting into this cash crop, and the first ones to attain a certain level of economic validity above subsistence farming. And so the first generation, they're all about making tea. The second generation, tea kind of hits this plateau in a lot of places where it becomes very difficult, very shinku, and like the rest of the world's progressing and you're still doing the same tea. Maybe it's not as hyped now. And then the third generation, depending on two tracks in the second, either the third generation, it all dries up and no one's making tea anymore, or the second generation is even more successful. Maybe you're in a popular region like the Shihu Longjing or like a really core region in the Wuyi Yanchas, and you can get back into it. But usually what happens here, the youth come back into tea if there is economic validity in it, if you can make a living with it, if you've already made enough money to survive and you're thriving. And so if you're not at that point, tea becomes just this other means of making enough money. And a lot of people see like, oh, I could, instead of working huge amounts of hours and physical labor, I could move to the city and get a desk job really, really easy and make as much money, if not more, and then live in a city with better amenities. So a lot of the youths are moving out of the villages and stuff like that. And so I see this struggle with Wen Zitong, even though he is in a region where he can make a good deal of money off of tea, the Wudong Shan, which, as I mentioned in the last episode, is that core region. Their tea is sell for twice as much, 3 times as much as the rest of the Dancong region. And so it brings up a really interesting juxtaposition, counterbalance between making tea. Making tea, you have to kind of live in these isolated regions, in the mountains and the villages for a good portion of the year, versus participating in modern society sometimes. Like I know a guy who does Bingdao tea, and Bingdao, if you know about it, sells for huge amounts of money. This guy drives a Land Rover, he has a pool table in his tea room and everything, but he lives in rural Linsong area. And so it's just like, you can tell this guy, he travels a lot. He really likes the nicer things about life, but he's tied to this region. And so it's an interesting dichotomy between making tea and participating in the modern world that really a lot of people maybe they don't quite see in depth. And so, yeah, one thing I didn't quite mention about Wudong Mountain being on there is just the level of affluence I see in the people that are frequenting the area. Like, I saw a bunch of Mercedes Benz, Cadillacs, Land Rovers parked in these tiny mountain roads out there. People are making decent amount of money up there, but it still has that feeling, that traditional culture, that rural culture and vibe. And so again, it's just this interesting portion T where the modern world meets the ancient times, and or at least where it meets traditional culture. And sometimes these things are hard to predict. Things like Laobanjiang, Bingdao, Wudong Mountain, even like the Panxi regions and Fuding, you don't really know when they're going to pop off and explode in popularity. And so just imagine having a very rural area with a bunch of farmers, and then you just pick one small county, and then you just say, like, okay, like your grain is going to be worth 3,000 times the rest of your neighbors. And then you just start dumping huge amounts of money into this one isolated rural region. And then you can kind of imagine the consequences of that. Sometimes this is what's happening in the tea world, and it's just really mind-boggling to see, going from one village to the next, and one is significantly better off. Which is not so dramatic in the Wudong Mountains, because I mentioned in the previous episode, the episode before last, episode 17, I believe, I talk about all the different regions that I'm buying tea from in the Phoenix Mountains, and they're all relatively similar. It's not like one is, even though Wudong Shan has a lot more money coming through it, the people are still living in the same level of luxury as other people. I guess I did see one person with an elevator in their home, which was pretty bizarre because it's like a 2-story house. But I guess you got to do it for tea, but it wasn't for a tea elevator. Anyways, getting back to this point and this episode. So, as is my wont for the tea soup episodes, what I do is I pick a type of tea. I talk about the history. Maybe I talk about the history of the region. I talk about sourcing it. I talk about the people I've met. And then finally, I talk about making it. And so that's what I'm going to do in this episode. I'm going to talk about making Dancong Oolong. And one really interesting thing that I came across as I was thinking about this episode is there are so many tea terms that I need to explain to you guys, because it's all just imported from the Chinese, like Wudong, Dancong, Oolong. Like those are 3 Chinese words just back to back to back. And if you don't understand them, it sounds like Chinese, because that's what it is. So what I've done is I've made a companion page on the website, a little blog post that talks about all of these Chinese words, the translation, and what they mean. And so if you get lost anytime in this episode as I'm explaining the processes using these jargon words, you can check out that page on the website, and I'll link to it in the show notes here. So let's see, where should we start here? I guess we can start with the name, Dancong Oolong. So, as a lot of you probably know, Oolong are 2 Chinese words. Wu means dark, which so it happens is also the Wu in Wudong Shan, which means dark soil. So the Wu in Oolong is the same character, which is very interesting. The Long in Oolong means dragon. And so Oolong tea literally means dark dragon. And supposedly it's because of the shape of the twisted leaves. And you should remember that a lot of the Oolong, the original Oolong, came from the Wei Mountains, where you have this strip style roasted Oolong tea. And then that migrated over to Chaozhou. And in Anxi, they started breaking the mold and doing the rolled Oolong. And so that's not really the dark dragon style, but that's where this name comes from, the Oolong. Now, Dancong literally means single bush. So Dan is single, bush is tree, right? And so Wudong, Dancong, Oolong literally means dark soil, single bush, black dragon. And so obviously I'm not going to literally translate these words, because you would have no idea what I was talking about. And so that's where sometimes it's nice just to use these Chinese words and people know what it means rather than directly translating it. So coming back to Dancong, which means single bush, a lot of people see this and they think it's Danju. Danju means single tree. So Danju is meaning harvest from a single tree. And so an entire lot, maybe 3, 4, 5 kilograms of tea is all made from a single entity, a single bush, a single tree. Dancong has single tree in its name as well, but the meaning here is a little different. The meaning here is that it's harvested cultivar by cultivar. Because you should know, within the Dancong family, there are over 200 different cultivars and varietals of this tea on the mountain. And what they did in ancient times is they isolated the different mutations, the different strange teas from the heirloom bushes, and they started only making that single tree. And so once upon a time it was single tree production, but then they took these single bushes, these outlying bushes that have their unique flavors, leaf shape, and taxonomy, and they created cultivars from them, cloned cultivars. And so if you know any genetics and agricultural propagation, cloning things, you're going to get 99.9 whatever percent the same genetics, the same bush, the same taste. And so these are all descendants of a single mother bush. And so the mother bush is also called a mu shu. And so here we have three terms. We have mu shu, which is mother bush. This is the ancient ancestral beginning of a single cultivar of Dancong Oolong, from which all the rest of the bushes are cloned. And Dancong, if they have 200 cultivars, they probably have 200 different mother bushes. Some people use this for really, really old trees, though, which is gushu. So I just threw another word at you. Sorry there. So mu shu is mother bush. Gushu is ancient tree. Danju is single tree production. And then Dancong is this whole category of oolong tea that they're making in the Phoenix Mountains. Are you confused yet? Because I hope not. Let me take a brief break here and tell you a story about what we're doing out in Hefeng. So out in Hefeng, where we've leased a bunch of land and we kind of work with the villagers on the mountains and the Lo Shui Yuan cooperative there, Alex, Xiaoyan, and a new woofer named Erica from the United States who's thinking about opening her own tea farm stateside, I believe in California, if that's correct. They all walked through the mountain and isolated different heirloom bushes and different mutations between them. And so because tea has grown on that mountain for quite a while, you have time to see this genetic change in them, these strange bushes that look different, taste different, whatever. Some of them, Alex said, did not taste good, but he was only eating the leaves. Anyways, what they have done is they've isolated maybe 8 different bushes that have genetic mutations. And so we're going to try and make danju productions of them. Remember what danju is? That's single bush production where we're only making tea from this single tree because it's a mutation. And then we can taste that tea and discern if it's good or not. And if it's good, then what we'll do is we'll start cloning it and we'll start planting it, propagating it. And this is how we're going to create our own Dancong production of green tea on this mountain in Hefeng. So again, you kind of have to understand a lot of these words to understand the idea behind this really exciting endeavor, I believe. Because if you don't understand how I'm using the term, it might sound very strange if I say I have this green tea and red tea garden and I'm thinking about making some Dancong. And so by Dancong here, I mean isolating different cultivars and harvesting and making them cultivar by cultivar and kind of creating our own cultivars. But what we will be making is green tea. And so it gets very, very convoluted here with a lot of jargon, which is why I really need to kind of talk about it. So I've mentioned 2 other terms here. There's cultivar and varietal. The way I'm using this, cultivar is artificial selection. Cultivar is when we find a tea and we clone it and we really try and make it what it is. A varietal is some natural mutation, natural variant of the tea that's appearing on the mountain. And this is how I'm using the term. I'm not sure if this is particularly how you're supposed to, but in everything I talk about, everything I write about, this is my distinction between the two. Varietal is a natural mutation that's found in a region. Cultivar has a little more man-made influence. People taking it, cloning it, selecting it. So that's what they call artificial selection versus natural selection. So varietal is natural selection. Cultivar is artificial selection. And so while we're still talking about trees, tea trees, I mentioned gushu, I mentioned mushu. So again, mushu is the mother tree. Gushu is the old ancient tree. And gushu you usually see used to describe the pu'er teas. And usually these teas get really old, like over a couple hundred years old. However, there is no one way to say it. There is no one defining term for this is now gushu because it's over 200 years old. People use these terms in so many different ways. But one interesting thing that you rarely see in the oolong world and the rest of the tea world are people talking about gushu for white tea, for oolong tea, for green tea, red tea, whatever. That's usually specifically for pu'er tea. And the reason for this, I believe, is because pu'er teas have a longer lifespan. So these trees, the Camellia sinensis assamica in this region, in that climate, in the region, they can grow several hundred years old. As you get further away from Yunnan, kind of up the coast towards Fujian, the span of tea trees, their lifespan gets shorter and shorter and shorter. They get smaller and smaller and smaller. And another way to envision this is in Pu'er, in Yunnan, you can climb the gushu trees. They get really, really thick. Where the oldest bushes in Fujian, they're thin and slender and you can pull them down. And very rarely in the oolong regions can you climb a tree. I've seen a few trees being able to be climbed. But the lifespan for trees in this region usually maxes out. I've seen very few, if any, older than 300 years old. But usually, gushu in the Dancong region is not called gushu, it's called lao song. Lao song means old bush. So again, that song is the same song as in Dancong. Dancong means single bush, lao song means old bush. Now, what determines an old bush? This is unfortunately, there's no right answer to this. There's no single answer. And it does kind of make sense because, as I mentioned, different trees in different regions have different lifespans. And so you can't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. And so you have to say, this tea in this region grows to this age. And so anything over a certain age is old. So that's what you're seeing in the Wudong Mountains, in the Phoenix Mountains, and you see this with elevation in the same way. If the peak elevation is 1,100 meters, then anything over 900 meters is probably high elevation in the region relative. And so anything in this region that's over, I usually see Lao Song begin about 80 years old. Any bush that's over 80 years old has become Lao Song. I think a better way to kind of think about Lao Song or kind of articulate it would be the height of the tree, the size of the tree, because I think that would really help show you, at least on the surface area, kind of its root structure, its depths, because what really cultivates this old bush flavor is the roots reaching down into the anaerobic environment of the clay, and they work a little harder, they extract more minerals, and it changes the flavor of the tea in a real way that you can taste. And so that's kind of the trump card when we're talking about Lao Song and Gushu, Old Bush, and what's Old Bush, what's not Old Bush. If you really can, just taste the difference. Then you'll know. Then it doesn't matter what the tree looks like. It doesn't matter what the farmer says. You can taste the difference. And so if you get to that level, I mean, I would say trust your tongue, trust your palate more than anything you read online and stuff like that. Because I've come across fluke teas that are really, really cheap but have that Lao Song flavor. And I just have no idea what happened. It's probably just a really like clay-rich environment or something like that. And like the farmer's selling it to me for like not very expensive. And I'm like, this is incredible tea. So really just trust your palate. And again, I don't market it as Gushu, of course. I'm just like, oh, very, very lucky with this one. I'll talk more about tree names, tree ages, how to distinguish Qiaomu, Dashu, Xiaoshu, Gushu, Dashu, Zhongshu, and all of that. Guanshu, I think, is the bush one. Anyways, I'll talk about that when I talk about pu'er tea, because that's really important with pu'er, because they give these teas different prices. In the Dancong world, it's very clear, is it Lao Song or not? Is it this region or not? So it's kind of binary in that regard. Okay, so that was a lot of talk about the different types of trees. Starting with the name, man, I just tried to unpack Dancong and it took me about 20 minutes. Just the name Dancong Oolong. Anyways, oh, there's a nice little Chinese I've been speaking too much Chinese lately. Anyways, what I'm going to do now is tell you the story about when I first started seeing them make Dancong. And this goes back to one of our favorite producers I talked about in episode 17, I believe, maybe 16. This is Lin, who we call Proper Family Man. The guy with like his wife, his mom, and his 3 daughters, and he makes all the food, stays at home, and makes all the tea. He was the first one I watched make the entire process of Dancong Oolong, and I'm really grateful for him. I think this is back in 2017 in October, and so he was making a late season picking, an autumn picking. And in Chinese, in the Dancong region, and a lot of the Oolong region, they have a saying. It's 春水秋香, which means spring water, autumn fragrance. And so the teas that are made, the oolong teas that are made in spring, usually have a better kogan. Kogan means mouthfeel than the teas that are made in autumn. But the ones in autumn have a little more shangqi, which is like that fragrance energy. And so let me back up a bit and give you the whole travel log of this first experience because it was really my first experience seeing the Dancong Oolong production. What happens in China is every year during their national week, the first week of October, they give everyone in the country about 1 week off. And this is like a great and a terrible idea because traffic gets so bad, everyone travels. And so what I did in 2017, instead of going to a really hip spot like Huangshan or a scenic area like Guilin, I went to Chaozhou. I went to the Phoenix Mountains. I went to the Phoenix Village. And I get there and of course no travelers are there. Only the people who live there are there. And so I get into Chaozhou, find a way to get up to the mountain. I'm trying to think how I got up to the mountain. I think I couldn't find the bus that takes me to the mountain. They told me to go to several different bus stations, and then they all said go to the other bus station. I was like, I was just there, and they said come here. I think eventually I hired a private driver who was hanging out outside of the truck station, the bus station. And in China, they call them black cabs, and you can just really just name your price, tell them how much you want, and then they'll drive you up to the mountain. I think it cost me like $30. It was like 45-minute drive or something like that. I get to the village. There's one hotel in the Phoenix Village that is able to rent to foreigners. In China, it's very particular. They need to see your passport. They need to see your visa. They need to make proper documentation that, a foreigner stayed in this hotel at this time and had all the proper paperwork, blah, blah, blah. And so a lot of the smaller hotels, they can't legally do it, though they sometimes do it just because no one's really going to check them. But there's one official hotel at that time, I think there are more now, in the Phoenix Village that could rent to foreigners. This is back in 2017. And so I rented that hotel. They give me a room on the top floor. It's like a tiny village. Not tiny village is probably the wrong word. Small town. And, it has most of the amenities you would expect in a town. It's not like a village where people are living in huts. It's like people are driving cars. There are bigger buildings. But this is probably the biggest, tallest building. And it's like 13 floors. And so I get in the elevator. They go all the way up to the top floor. That's where they put me. And it's this beautiful view that overlooks the entire valley because the Phoenix Village is kind of set in this mountain valley, in this mountainous region, in the Phoenix Mountain Range. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. Of course, this is one of the hotels. If you rent a hotel in China in the tea world, in a tea producing region, they usually have a gaiwan, a tea tray, and teacups ready for you. And so, yeah, I get there. There's the electric water kettle, which is they have electric water kettles in every hotel in China. They have hot water on the trains, in the train stations, in the airports. It's everywhere. And so it's really a tea country anyways. So I get to this hotel and it's really nice compared to the rest of the smaller town. And I see some tea fields and mountains in the distance. And I'm like, okay, I set my bag down. I have zero contacts. As I mentioned, when I do these tea trips, I usually come with zero contacts in mind. And I just open myself up to fate and luck and chance. And I spin that roulette wheel and I hone my chances of getting into the right position and looking for the lucky opportunities. And so I'm on top of this building looking out at the Phoenix Village and I see the tea mountains in the distance. I see some tea fields and I'm like, okay, I'll walk in that direction. And so I set down my bag. This is actually before I bought a camera. I only bought a camera, I think in 2020. A Fujifilm. I love it. X series. But before that, I was just using my iPhone. And so I don't even take my camera. I just have my iPhone. I think I have my notepad. Go down and I just walk in that direction. Cars are passing. I start seeing tea fields in the right next to me, little paths that walk up it, but I'm kind of walking towards that mountain I found. And on the way, eventually I come across this really level tea field garden. And so in this region, as I mentioned, it's a valley. And so when I say the Phoenix Village, I'm talking about this flat level of land, this expansive land, and it has a lot of tea production going on in here. And so there are tons and tons, thousands of tons of tea probably being made in this region on the flat lands with short bushes. This is not Laosong. This is not Gushu. This is not Mushu. This is not Wudong. This is not Gaoshan. Gaoshan means high mountain. This is just very regular tea that they're going to make into inexpensive tea, sell it to other people who can process it. And so I'm walking by one of these fields and I see a guy making tea in his garage. And I just go for it. I just stand there and I just kind of start watching him. And he like looks at me, we kind of like nod or wave or whatever, and he just keeps doing what he's doing. And I keep watching the process, and then eventually I take out my little notebook and I start writing down what's going on. And eventually it strikes up the conversation. I'm here, I'm trying to learn more about the dancehall production. And so he just immediately starts telling me, just narrating the director's commentary of everything he's doing, why he's doing it. And he's a very friendly guy, I found out. And this is why I really love Lin, proper family man. And so let me walk you through the stages of the dance song production, because Lin, what he does is he makes mao cha. Now, mao cha is raw tea. This is kind of difficult to understand if you just hear raw tea. Like, what is that? Is that just the tea leaf? Raw tea or mao cha is tea that you can drink. It's dried tea, it's twisted tea, it's rolled tea. All of this process has been done to it, and now it's able to be drunk. However, we'll get to this later. It's usually called mao cha because there's a stage missing. This is like the penultimate stage. So let me tell you what Lin was doing and what I was seeing. There was on his really nice clean floor, this, tile floor that he sweeps. I saw him. He had all of the fresh tea that was picked laid out on it, and it was kind of cooling, drying, wilting, and this is called wei diao. Wei diao is the withering process where the water is coming out of the tea leaf and it's becoming more pliant, more rubbery. And so tea that you pick off the bush is immediately hard. If you bend the leaf in half, it will snap. And you can do this experiment right now. Go find a leaf, pick it off the tree, bend it in half. It will snap. Take another leaf, put it in your room, put it in a kind of controlled environment, maybe in light, maybe outside of light, but give it some time and come back after a few hours and see if you can bend it in half. What you want to do with this wei diao process is let it wither down so that the leaves get very, very soft, because this will help it retain its integrity when you pass it through the next steps. So with Dancong Oolong, the first thing you do is you pick it, and then you let it wither. And this is also kind of like sun withering or shade withering. And so sometimes they'll put it out in the sunlight to speed up the withering process. Sometimes you can do it inside. The actual heat doesn't really matter here. The sunlight doesn't really matter here. If you're doing it in the sunlight, you have to take a lot more control over it. It speeds up the process, but you can make a lot of off flavors at this time if you're not doing it right. And so it's easier to do it kind of in a shaded environment, in an indoor environment with a lot of heat. And if you get into these rooms, there is a lot of moisture in the air. It feels like a greenhouse. With Dancong Oolong, this process usually takes six hours or so. And so the tea that's picked in the morning is ready to start being processed in the evening. Sometimes, depending on the ambient humidity, the amount of water in the leaves, the temperature and everything, it could take longer, it could take shorter. But that's why you have a tea maker and a master. And so after the tea is withered, this wei diao process, then comes the shaking process. This is particular to Dancong Oolong production and to any other Oolong production, actually. The goal of this stage, after the initial withering, is semi-oxidization. In Chinese, they call it ban fa zhao. Fa zhao is fermentation, but in Chinese, it also means oxidization. And so this is where you see, oh, it's actually not fermented, it's oxidized. I'm surprised they're saying it's fermented. In Chinese, it's the same word. And so that's where the origin of this misconception comes from, is because tea is older than modern science, and the tea terms are older than modern discoveries on what's actually going on. And so this ban fa jiao, half fermentation, which really just means half oxidization, this is the green belly and red edges. And so oxidization, as I mentioned, is what happens if you hit a banana peel, and then the banana peel turns from bright yellow into just brown, right where you hit it. This is where air is coming in, and the enzymes that react to the oxygen start changing the molecular structure, the chemical structure of the tea plant. And so with Dancong Oolong, you want this half oxidization phase, this ban fa jiao. And so there are two means of doing it. After the tea is withered, you peng qing and then you yao qing. So peng qing is kind of like heaping the green. Yao qing means shaking the green. And while these two sound very similar, they're a little different. The Yao Qing is a little more violent, and the Peng Qing is a little more delicate. And again, you're working with tea leaves that are at different stages of withering. And so the first stage is the Peng Qing, where you take all the tea that's been withered, that's getting relatively pliant, and you heap it, kind of like maybe 6 inches thick or so, onto a bamboo basket, a flat bamboo basket, and you put these on racks. And then that's all you needed to do. Then you step away for like an hour, and then you come back, smell the tea, look at the tea. It should start, even more oxidizing. It'll lose its weight and its volume considerably by the end of this process. This process usually starts around evening, right after dinner, like 6 or 7 p.m., and it'll go until 3 a.m. maybe. So what you're doing is you're looking at it every hour, every 30 minutes, and then you step away. Then you come back and you do another punching. So doing another punching means you rearrange it on the basket again. And so you lightly take it up and set it down. When I was with Wen Zitong this spring, he talked how you can make dancong just based off the sound of it, not even the smell of it. When I was there with Lin the first time, Lin was a very olfactory guy where he's smelling the tea at every stage and he's waiting for the fragrance to tell him when to do things. With Wen Zitong, he does the fragrance, he does the sight, he does the smell. He's like, tea tastes all of your senses. And so if you're really making tea right, you're feeling the tea, you're listening to the tea, you're smelling the tea, and you're seeing the tea. And if you want to, you can taste it as well. But again, at this stage, you hear this really nice sha 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 sha. There's a little ASMR for you. That's the sound of the tea leaves that are making as you're rotating them on these baskets. And eventually, the shake wilting gets more and more violent throughout the night. And so by the end of it, you get that iconic method of yaoqing, which is shake wilting, where you have all the tea on the basket and you do a little rotation, rotation, rotation. All the tea starts waving around in the basket. This is very iconic of the oolong production methods. I've seen it in Anxi, in the Wuyi Mountains, and then, of course, in the Dancong region. Now, when I say making Dancong Oolong is difficult and time-consuming and tiring, and when Wen Zitong says he doesn't want to do it anymore, it's because of this process, which is, it's not really difficult to do as far as labor and energy goes, but it takes a long time. You have to spend like 8 or 10 hours every day during tea season just listening to the leaves, moving them around, and then waiting for another hour or two. I remember being up with Master Wei. Wei is really fun. I spent maybe the most amount of time with Wei. So the first year I visited Lin and I saw him do it, and I met Wei in the Phoenix Village. He has a little shop there. The second year and the third year and the fourth year, I love it. I went up to hang out with Wei when he was making tea. And this is when I really learned the production like the back of my hand. Like I can just do this episode without really making any notes or saying anything beforehand. Anyways, with Wei, he has apprentices every year, and sometimes the apprentices are really just there to learn the tea, but also just to keep him company during these long stretches of boredom in the spring nights. Because yeah, like we'll do the yaoqing, do the pengqing, and then just go sit down, drink tea for an hour and a half, and then you do that 6 times, 7 times every night for 35 days. Like it eventually gets boring. And so I remember just some funny moments with Wei where he's like, all right, guys, tonight I got this case of beer and we're going to be drinking one after every yaoqing. And it's like, oh boy, here it goes. And then it's like, he's like doing things where he's making hot pot. We're making like instant noodles. And so he has like an electric burner. He has a bunch of bones, puts like the beef bones in there, adds the liquid, starts stirring it, and then adds the instant noodles, and we're all just like eating out of the same pot. It's a really nice experience. Really, it reminds me of doing a wood fire kiln down in Chaozhou with Xie Hua and his apprentices, and with Zhang Yin Chao. And what was really fun about that is like, like with a wood fire kiln, you have to stoke the fires consistently for about 3 days. And so like every night there's somebody through the night stoking the flames. And so, Usually, like the first night it happens, everyone kind of hangs out together, keeps each other company. There's food involved, hot pot, maybe some beers, and it's just a kind of a long time where you're trying to make this difficult process a little more easy. And so this is one of my favorite parts about sourcing Dancong, and then also one of the hardest parts. I think I mentioned in the last episode, I hung out with Wenzatong for about 4 or 5 days, stayed up with him every night, and he would do this funny thing. Like when he's in between doing the pengqing and the yaoqing, he'd go over to the neighbors and he'd see a different neighbor, a different neighbor, a different neighbor. And he's like, yeah, this is my uncle. This is my cousin. This is my brother. This is my friend. And he's like, okay, let me try your Dongfang Hong. And we drink it, talk, and then go back to his place. And then we'd say what we actually thought about the tea. And it's just really cool living on the mountain, because also on the mountain during this time, everyone's doing the same thing. Everyone's staying up late at night. Everyone has this cycle of like, oh, I got to tend the tea. Oh, I can just relax. Oh, I got to tend the tea. I remember getting really drunk with the neighbors on Baijiu, and then they're like, oh, everyone set down your glasses. We got to go do some tea work. And so it's just like really, it's this festive spirit in my mind. But after so long, my body just couldn't take it, because we'll get into this pretty soon. After this, you have to wake up early and do the kill green. So the first stage is that picking. Then you have the withering. Then you have the shake wilting. And then at the end of shake wilting, this is one funny thing about whey. And I guess for other tea farmers, I've heard them use this term before, which is totally inaccurate in the way they're using it. And so they say like the last Yao Qing at about 3 a.m., when the tea is finally reduced in size, like to a fourth of what it was or more, they say the very final shake wilting process is called sha qing. Sha qing means kill the green. And sha qing in the rest of the tea world, they use this term to talk about de-enzymating the tea, raising the tea to a certain, heating up the tea in a big wok or an oven, and denaturing the enzyme that causes oxidization. So it's called fixing the tea. It's called sha qing, kill the green, kill the enzyme that makes it oxidize. And so what they're doing is they're like, oh, we're doing one more roll in this rolling machine, one more shake wilt, and then now the green has been killed. And I'm like, no, it's not. The green is still there. Like, it's still oxidizing. You haven't raised any temperature. You haven't done the kill green stage yet. He's like, oh, what you're saying, what you think is sha qing is chao qing. And chao qing means like, chao is like to fry, and the green, qing is green. So in the rest of the Chinese world, they say sha qing is when you kill the enzymes. In Chaozhou, they say sha qing is the end of the yao qing phase, and then you let it sit overnight, and then in the morning you chao qing, which is when you actually kill the green. Anyways, really small nuance there that confused the heck out of me when I first heard these farmers saying it. So again, the tea is you do the yao qing until late at night, maybe 3 a.m., and then you finally get to go to bed. But then you have to wake up in like 6 hours or 4 hours, depending on how long the yao qing takes, and then you kill the green in the morning. That's the first thing you do. You go downstairs, and here's one thing I forgot to mention, actually. One thing Wei is very proud of, and I've seen all the other makers do it as well. When you're doing the yao qing, when you're doing the shake wilting, the tea eventually wilts, and every time you come back to it, the stalks, the stems are really, really bendy. If you pick a leaf up, it'll fall over. It'll just bend right over. And then you do the proper yao qing, and it revitalizes the tea in some strange way. Or after they do the yao qing properly late at night, you pick up the same leaf, and instead of bending, it stands straight up. And I have no idea how they do this, but that's usually the factor, the thing that they're really proud about. And so if you see people making tea in this yao qing phase, you can see if they're making it right based on if the tea is standing up or not. Anyway, small, really niche note there. Anyways, in the morning, what you do is you kill the green. And in the green tea area, we talked about Bilochun and we talked about Dragonwell. The kill green is done in a wok. Here in Chaozhou, in the Dancong region, it's done in a big kill green machine, which is like a turbine, like an oven turbine. It's just like circling oven vent, and you put the tea in there. I forget the precise numbers. I have notes and photos and videos, but if you want to know that, message me, email me, hit me up on the Instagram, and I'll look at the pictures and tell you. But you put it in the kill green machine, which is just a big oven, for a matter of minutes, and then you dump the tea out. And then you see, look at it, feel it, see if the green has been killed. And then this is what I was seeing Lin doing in the morning when I walked by. He was doing the kill green, and he would dump the tea out. And the tea would just be this hot, steaming pile of wet, sticky tea. And then what happens is, now that the tea has finally the green has been killed and it won't oxidize anymore, you can treat the leaves really, really harsh. They're really pliant, really rubbery, wet, soft, and you put them through this rolling machine. This is the Ronianji, and this is what gives the tea its final shape, that twisted oolong dark dragon shape. And you put it in a rolling machine. In other places, in Pu'er, in Lao, in a lot of other regions, traditionally, this is done by hand, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of energy, and I haven't really seen anyone in the Phoenix Mountains roll their tea by hand. And so if you do know some people that are doing it by hand, let me know, because that would be really interesting to see and taste. But I'm not sure if you could taste the difference. You might be able to see the difference. I know with Anshi, you can see the hand-rolled tea, or sometimes foot-rolled tea. I'll tell you about that later. As a different shape in the ball. It's not as tight, and it has this little tail, this little fish tail in it of the ball oolong. And that's how you can really tell it's hand-rolled versus machine-rolled. Anyways, in the Phoenix Dancong, after the green has been killed, you put it in this Ronianji, and that rolls the tea, twists the tea, and then it just like dumps it out. And you dump it out into this big pile, and then what you have is a big tangled pile of wet, steaming hot tea still. And so what you need to do now is you need to unblock the tea. This is another stage that I was kind of confused about, is this breaking up machine or unblocking machine. And so what they do is they need to separate all this tea so it doesn't clump together when it's hot and warm. And so they put it through this machine that lightly separates, kind of like shifts the tea leaves out onto a thin metal rack. And so then you have these thin metal rack baskets that you put on another rack. And so eventually it becomes really, really thin. When you were doing the Yao Qing, it was, a couple inches thick. Here it's like leaf by leaf thin. So you have a whole lot of racks. And so you unblock it and you let it tang liang, which is like lay and cool. And you let it cool down to kind of just room temperature. And then what you do is you put it through the first stage of the baking machine. And this is also called the Hongganji. Different Hongganjis are done in different ways in different areas of the Chinese world. But in Chaozhou, what I saw is there are three types. One is gas, one is wood-fired, and one is electric. Lin was doing entirely gas Hongganji. Wei and Wenzitong, they use wood-fired Hongganji. And so this gives the tea a little bit of that toasted, roasted flavor that you sometimes assume is charcoal roasted tea, but it hasn't been charcoal roasted. It's only been baked. And so I think last year, the year before, I released this wood-fired collection, which is the early spring teas that passed this phase and were just put into a wood-fired oven and not actually charcoal roasted. But what happens is you have to put them in this oven several times. You put them in for a few minutes, you take them out, you let them cool again. Then you put it in, let it bake, take it out. And you kind of change the temperatures eventually, because what you're trying to do is trying to dry the tea out. And then eventually what you do is you kind of fix the flavors. And so this is also called the tea wenji, which is like the fragrant fixing machine. And eventually what happens is the tea is finally dry and the fragrance peaks, and you can dump it into a big pile, sort it out by different cultivars, and then finally, at long last, you have Dancong Mao Cha. But this is far, far from making actual Dancong. This is still about 6 months out from actual Dancong Oolong. This is just the Dancong Mao Cha production, which is already a huge amount of work for the farmers. So let's recap. How do we make Dancong Mao Cha? Well, first, of course, the tea needs to be picked. Then it needs to be withered, either in the sun or in the shade. Then it needs to be wilted. And this wilting has two phases. One is the pengqing, which is stack piling wilting. And the second is the yaoqing, which is shake wilting. And this will oxidize it down to the green bellies and red edges, that half oxidization tea that we're looking for. Then you have the next morning the kill green machine, the kill green phase. This de-enzymates the tea and fixes it at a certain stage. Then you have the rolling machine, which gives the tea its iconic shape. And some say it brings some of the chemicals and flavors, breaks the cell wall, macerates it so it steeps very easily. Then you have the unblocking machine, so you don't have big clumps of this tea, and instead you have strip by strip. Then you have the baking machine, which is also the drying machine, which is also the fragrance fixing machine. And this can be gas, this can be electric, or this can be wood fired. And usually, the better the teas are, the more often you'll see a wood fired baking machine. So, just for Dancong Maocha, which sells for about half the price of the finished tea, you're looking at 7 different steps that require a lot of attention, that require specific equipment, require somebody that has been doing it for a long time. 7 different distinct steps where at any point, if you do this wrong, it could affect the flavor of the final tea, which also takes place over a 24-hour phase, 24-hour span. So all of this needs to happen in a single day from when it's picked. And so there's a lot of pressure during these 35, 40 days of spring tea season to get this done. And so that's why I'm saying my farmers, they don't have a moment's rest during the spring tea season. They can't roast their tea. They can't do anything else. If I see them during the tea season, I visit them, I accompany them. I just follow them around like a puppy, doing whatever they're doing, watching whatever they're doing. They have no time, but they really appreciate the camaraderie. They appreciate the company because, as I said, making tea, doing that shake wilting and then waiting for an hour or 2 hours, it's really lonely because it happens at 2 a.m. Like Wenzatong he's the only one up in his house at that time. And so it's really nice to just hang out and get to know these makers during that time. So that brings us up to Dancong Maocha. So getting back to the initial story, meeting Lin, seeing his production, and I was able to come back the next day and see the whole production. I didn't stay up late at night with Lin, but he did walk me through the whole process. And one interesting thing about Lin is he only makes the Maocha. He doesn't make anything else. And so when he makes the Maocha, he's done. And he just works all the time just making Maocha. And then he sells his Maocha to other people with shops and stores and production facilities that maybe they don't have farms, maybe they don't have gardens, maybe they don't have enough tea. So he sells his Maocha to people that will finish the tea. And one person that would buy tea from him, not necessarily from him, but from people like him, is Xiao Shu. Xiao Shu from the Xie family. He has a very, very small garden, maybe 30 mu or so. And he wants to sell, thousands of pounds of tea a year. But he can't make that much himself. And so what he does is he buys Maocha from other people, and then he sorts it, and then he processes it. So what happens with this sorting phase once you have the Maocha? Say you could literally go into the Phoenix Mountains and buy Maocha, and then you could do all the stages yourself, the next steps. So the next steps, the first thing you need to do is this sorting. The sorting is called the jiagong. Jiagong literally means to add work. And you have a whole lot of Maocha. Within the Maocha, you have ugly leaves. These ugly leaves are last year's leaves that accidentally got picked. If you look at a tree, you'll have the new shoots from this spring, from this growth season, and then you'll have the older leaves from last year. These older leaves are tougher, they're harder, they're more brittle, there's not enough water content in them for them to process rightly. And so if you process them in the same way, they'll retain their shape and their color. And they'll look really noticeable when you look at the nice twisted black teas of the Dancong Oolong. Then you see this like really old, large yellow leaf. It looks like a shou mei leaf, like a white tea leaf in there. The jiagong process, the sorting process, is to remove all of these tea leaves. You remove all of the old tea leaves, you remove all of the stems, and then you look through the tea and make sure nothing else got in there. Sometimes blades of grass get in there, straw, plants, stuff from other plants and stuff like that just get blended in there on accident, picked in baskets, whatever. This sorting phase is usually done by hand. What you have is you have essentially like this nice square card table has like, slightly elevated edges all around it, like 1 or 2 inches. And then in one corner, you have this like, it looks like a tea tray. And, you have this little break where you can just shove stuff out. Usually what happens is you dump a bunch of Maocha on there, and then some person, usually it's an older woman, an IE who's not involved in other processes of the tea, She looks through all of the leaves, takes out all the huang pian, all of the stems, and then puts the rest of the tea into the finished bag, which is already sorted tea. This is still not finished tea, though. I remember this sorting phase, removing the huang pian, this happens all through the Oolong region. I remember going to the Anshi wholesale market and I saw just a bunch of ladies gossiping, sorting through the Maocha. And I was like, oh, wow, that was my first realization that Anshi Tieguanyin also has Maocha, also has huang pian and stems and stuff like that. And so I remember buying some of the Anshi Tieguanyin Maocha because it was my first time seeing it. I haven't sold it, but I think it would be a really cool experience to sell it and show people. Because as I said, I bought some of Lin's Maocha and sold it because it's a cool experience. It's a type of the tea, a snapshot into this world that you've never really experienced unless you're deep into the sourcing of it. Now, this sorting phase takes so much time. It's not difficult. It's kind of exciting and fun if you like it. It's very dopamine rush where it's like you're just like, oh, that's a bad leaf, that's a bad leaf, anyone can do this, and it kind of feels good. I remember every time I go into Hui Wei's little tea house and I see Miss Chen, she's there. She has her sorting table out and she's sorting through tea. Sometimes she does the gerbil. The gerbil is like live stream, and so she'll just live stream her sorting tea, talking to the camera. It's takes a long time. Even with Xiaozhang and Liao, when I visited them, they let me participate in the sorting stuff, and they did a little gerbil of me doing it. I think I helped them sell some of their tea domestically. Like, wow, look, here's an American who's come to Chaozhou to study Chinese tea, and he's sorting out tea in our tea house. You can buy some of the tea that he's touched with his fingers. I don't think they marketed it like that, but it could sell. I mentioned Xiao Chu or the Xie family. I think he doesn't do the hand sorting just because it's him, his mom, and his dad. Very small production team. I think what you can do is you can get a machine, or you don't want to get a machine because it's like takes. How big would this be? It's a massive machine, like bigger than a semi truck almost, and it's just like it's this conveyor belt that has a bunch of blades on it, not really blades, but like rakes that are sorting out for huang pian. And so what you can do is you can find somebody with one of these sorting machines and bring your tea there, and for a fraction of the cost or fraction of the time, in a matter of minutes, you can sort all of your tea and save yourself a lot of work. And so a lot of people will do this, but usually for the higher quality teas, the teas that are being properly charcoal roasted, that are selling for a lot, they're all sorted by hand. So after the tea is sorted by hand, and again, remember this is Dancong, and so what usually happens is they'll do one entire varietal, the yield of one varietal, and they'll sort it all. And so when I'm buying Dancong, sometimes if I check too early, they only have 3 or 4 varietals of tea ready because the rest hasn't been sorted yet. So after sorting comes the charcoal roasting. And I think as I mentioned in the last episode, the charcoal roasting, usually the classic Dancong is charcoal roasted 3 times, and then usually rested for about 10 to 12 days between each roast. Now, how do you roast the tea? What you do is you have this basin, you fill it with charcoal, you heat the charcoal flames up, gets really red hot, and then eventually it starts becoming ash. And what you want to do is you want this nice cover of ash over your really hot charcoal. And this is really important because we'll get into this here in a second. You don't want any smoke flavor in the tea. You just want charcoal heat. And so what you do is you have this hot basin of coals, nice little blanket of ash over it, and then you put on top of it a bamboo basket with a bamboo mat where you can put all of your tea on it. And so you put maybe 3 kilograms, 4 kilograms, up to 6 kilograms of tea into this bamboo basket that's on your charcoal, that's on your bed of charcoal, and you let it heat up. You want an internal temperature, I believe 90 degrees Celsius is for the light bake, and then around 110 degrees Celsius for the heavy bake. And you want to do this for 12 to 18 hours, usually not so much more than 18 hours. But another really big problem with this is it's happening during the summer months. It's happening in like May, June, and July when the temperatures are so hot in this really, really hot and humid region. And then you have these like constant charcoal basins that are just like heating up your tea in your place. Oh my gosh. I've visited people and it's just unbearable. So again, this is and other reasons why this tea is so difficult, and I respect the people making it so much because it's not easy. And I'll mention this in the next episode. I've seen the price of Dancong rise considerably in the past couple years. And my point here is that I don't think it's getting more expensive. I think it's just becoming more accurately priced because of the amount of work involved in it. Way more work than any other type of tea I've seen. So what you do is you charcoal roast it. And you have to be really careful when you're handling the tea over the charcoal basins because you don't want any tea debris to fall into the charcoal because anything that falls into the charcoal will ignite, will flame up, and create smoke. And so you have to be very careful when you're handling the tea that's on the charcoal. You have to be very careful how you're making your charcoal and how you're getting the heat because you don't want any smoke, you don't want any debris in it, whatever. What you're doing though is you're roasting it like that for one day, then you set it off, let it cool down, package it up, let it meld and everything for another 2 weeks, and then you roast it again. Usually, traditionally processed Dancong has about 3 roasts in it. However, I met one guy, everyone has their different styles. I met one guy who had this secret technique of equipment he had been designing himself to help roast the tea more efficiently, more effectively, and he was telling me that he does 5 different roasts for his teas. He also changes the type of charcoal he uses. Towards the end of it, on the 5th roast, he's using only olive pit charcoal, which is insane. It's really expensive. And so I had his teas, and they were really interesting because he roasts them 5 times and does it so peculiarly. But it didn't taste any really different for me. Maybe give it a year. Maybe it was too fresh. But again, here's another thing. When you're charcoal roasting it, if you're drinking it, similar to the matcha, the tea is way too fresh. It doesn't taste like the tea it will taste like. And so this is one of my big problems. I'll talk about this in the next episode when I talk about how I drink tea and how I taste the Dancong oolongs. If you're drinking it right off the fire, in Chinese, in the TCM, they'll say it has 香火. It has a lot of heat in it. And so if you drink too much, it's really easy for your body to get sick, for you to get 香火, a little uncomfortable. And that's why it's really good to let these teas rest. And for me in particular, I like letting them rest multiple months before I really like drinking them. There are 2 different styles of tea right off the bat here. There are a lot more, but as far as the roasting goes, I know in the Wuyi Mountains, you'll have a lot of different styles, like the foot heat, the middle heat, the low heat, and stuff like that. In Chaozhou, you have 2 different styles. One is the Nongshang, which is heavy fragrance, and then you have the Qingshang, which is light fragrance. These teas have both been charcoal roasted, but maybe the Qingshang teas, they're roasted at a lower temperature, maybe for less hours, and the Nongshang get a longer roast at higher temperatures. And I have a few Nongshangs this year, I think 3 or 4, but I usually gravitate towards the medium roasted stuff and sometimes on the lighter stuff. And this is the spring teas. And so there are different styles of teas. There's the Qingshang Yashishang, and this is the light style duck shit fragrance. And this is usually a snowflake harvest or the Shuipian harvest. The Shuipian harvest is a winter harvest, an autumn harvest. So these are the teas that are picked in autumn or winter. I guess that would be October or maybe even into November. And they're usually processed very light. They usually don't even get a charcoal roasting. And then they're called the Qingshang style. So they're really, really light. We call them fragrant. If you ever see the word fragrant before Dancong on our website, you know it's this style where it hasn't been charcoal roasted. I actually sell a lot of this tea domestically within China just because it's incredibly fragrant. I sell it to my friends in cocktail bars and coffee houses because it's really, really noticeable. It's surprising how fragrant this tea is. However, this is not the typical Dancong we're talking about. This is this different harvests. So for the different harvests, you have the spring harvest and the autumn harvest. And remember what we said earlier, 春水秋香, spring, water, autumn, fragrance. And so the autumn, they're really looking on the fragrance of the tea. They're not worried about the kogan, the mouthfeel. The mouthfeel, the shui, the spring water, that's all about roasting it. That's all about the thickness of the tea on the mouth. And here in the autumn, we're only worried about the fragrance of it. Alright, so I hope I didn't bog you guys down with too many Chinese words and too much jargon or too many details here. Again, I will link the page that I created on my website that goes into a little more details and has a few more things. I talk about the different villages. I talk a lot more about the picking. I didn't quite cover the picking too much here. But yeah, I think I covered the basics for how you make dancong, from picking to final charcoal roasting and tasting. In the next episode, I'm going to talk a little more about, what I feel a good dancong is, how I taste the dancongs, my recommendations on brewing it, things that Wei would hit me for if I did wrong. That's not brewing your tea at boiling. You need to brew dancong at simmering temperatures. Anyways, more of that on the next episode. Thank you guys for sticking with me on this episode. I really hope you liked this deep dive into the dancong oolong making, the production side of things. Because as you can tell, I'm obviously really excited about it, really intrigued by the processing of it, and it's something I've studied quite a lot. I've been to the Phoenix Mountains every year, sometimes twice a year, and I think this episode really can show you, I've been picking up a lot of information during that time. And so a lot of the information for this podcast, for everything I do here, for the website, for the teas I'm selecting, this is information that comes directly from being in the villages, being on the mountains, talking to the makers, talking to the people that have been living with this tea culture all their lives. And that's really directing me. And here I am sharing it with you guys. So thank you guys so much for listening. This is really what animates my life. So happy to bring you guys along with it. Again, this is Derek from Wonder Tea. Until next time, guys, brew happy.